Welcome to this deep dive. Today we're tackling something really crucial and moving fast, how the world is trying to get a handle on artificial intelligence.
Yeah, it's a big one.
We'll focus mostly on the EU, the US, and China, but also, touch on India's emerging strategy. Their approaches are really going to shape AI's future and, well, affect all of us.
Definitely. And what's fascinating right away is this inherent tension, this push and pull in AI regulation.
You mean between innovation and safety?
Exactly. Encouraging all the amazing potential, but also making sure it's, used safely, ethically. And it's already clear these big global players are coming at that balance from, the very different perspectives.
Shaped by their own priorities and values, right?
Absolutely.
And it feels like this whole conversation, the urgency around AI regulation, it's really ramped up with generative AI becoming so prominent.
Oh, for sure. It's not just theory anymore, is it?
Yeah.
The impacts are becoming much more tangible.
Right. So our mission today is to really try and understand the core strategies, the key differences in how that EU, US, China, and maybe India too are tackling this really complex challenge.
Sounds good. Where should we start? Europe.
Yeah, let's begin in Europe. The EU's approach seems quite, comprehensive.
It definitely is. The European Union, they've really put forward a whole vision with their AI Act.
Aiming for a global standard, maybe? Like they did with GDPR for data privacy.
That seems to be the ambition,
Yeah.
yeah. And crucially, this is a regulation. That means it's directly binding across all the member states.
Ah, okay, so no need for each country to write its own separate law based on it.
Exactly. Direct application.
So how are they actually doing it? I mean, it sounds like they don't just treat all AI the same.
You're right, they don't. The EU AI Act, it's built on this risk-based system, basically categorizing AI systems based on the level of harm they could potentially pose.
Okay, risk-based. So what are the levels?
Well, at the very top, you have prohibited systems. Things the EU sees as fundamentally against human dignity, like government-run social scoring.
Right, I've heard about that. What else is prohibited?
Also things like real-time facial recognition in public spaces, with some very narrow exceptions. Then below that, you have the high-risk category.
High risk. And that's where most of the rules kick in, I guess.
Exactly. These face the most stringent requirements.
And what kind of AI falls under that high-risk umbrella? What are we talking about?
Think about AI used in really sensitive areas, places with significant potential impact. So AI in recruitment, HR, that kind of thing.
Okay, makes sense.
Also in law enforcement, or AI that's part of products where safety is critical, like in planes, cars, medical devices.
Right, you wouldn't want those getting it wrong.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And these high-risk applications, they're subject to a pretty detailed set of obligations.
Can you give us a feel for what those obligations actually involve? What do developers need to do?
Well, it ties back to the EU's really deep commitment to protecting fundamental rights, rooted in their history.
So rights are central.
Very central. For example, high-risk systems need these fundamental rights impact assessments. They also have to use high-quality training data.
High-quality data. What does that mean in practice? To avoid bias.
Yeah, basically trying to minimize bias. So for facial recognition used by police, say high quality would mean data sets that are diverse, represented across different groups.
To avoid, discriminatory outcomes.
Exactly. Plus, they need detailed technical documentation, measures for human oversight.
Human oversight. So a person has to be involved.
Yeah, to prevent purely AI-driven decisions in critical situations. And they also have to demonstrate accuracy, security, robustness. It's quite thorough.
Okay, that's high risk. What's below that?
Below that tier, you have limited risk systems.
Limited risk, like what?
This is things like chatbots or AI used to generate or manipulate media deepfakes, for instance.
Okay. So what's the rule there?
Here, the main focus is transparency. Users just need to be clearly told they're interacting with an AI.
Makes sense. Know what you're dealing with.
Right. And then at the very bottom, I've got minimal risk AI. Things like spam filters or, AI in video games.
And they're mostly left alone.
Pretty much outside the scope of this regulation, yeah.
Now, generative AI, things like ChatGPT, they've been huge news. How does the EU Act handle these big foundation models?
Good question. They get specific attention too.
So when we talk about foundation models, what are we actually referring to? Like the underlying tech?
Yeah, the big, powerful base models that other AI applications are often built on. The rules for them focus on transparency about how they work, the data they were trained on.
Okay, so knowing what's under the hood.
Right, and guidelines for making sure they're integrated safely into other applications. The EU wants accountability for these really powerful underlying technologies.
And how do they make sure all this is applied consistently across, all the EU countries?
They're setting up a European Artificial Intelligence Board. Its job will be to oversee implementation and enforcement, ensure everyone's on the same page.
It definitely sounds like the EU is trying to, well, lead the way, shape the global conversation here. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. They're clearly hoping for that Brussels effect again.
The Brussels effect. Remind me.
It's the idea that EU regulations, even if they only technically apply in the EU, become a kind of global standard, because companies worldwide just find it easier to adapt their products and practices everywhere to meet the EU rules.
Right, like we saw with GDPR on data privacy.
Exactly. GDPR is the classic example and went way beyond just privacy. But, there's a big question mark.
Which is?
Will the EU Act actually be flexible enough? Can it keep up with how incredibly fast AI is changing?
Ah, the speed problem.
Yeah, maintaining regulatory agility when the tech is evolving constantly, that's a huge challenge for this kind of comprehensive law.
Okay, so that's the EU's big picture. Let's cross the Atlantic now. How's the United States handling AI regulation?
Well, the U.S. approach, it really stands in pretty sharp contrast to the EU's big single regulation.
How so? More fragmented.
Much more. It's more sector-specific, kind of a patchwork, really. And there's a greater emphasis on voluntary compliance, guidelines, rather than hard law, at least initially.
And the thinking behind that is, let innovation run free for a bit.
That seems to be the general idea, yeah.
Yeah.
Avoid stifling innovation while the field is still, developing so rapidly. It does feel a bit like the U.S. approach to data privacy before GDPR really forced the issue globally.
It's an interesting tightrope walk. Wanting growth, but also seeing the potential downsides starting to emerge. So how's this actually playing out at the federal level?
At the federal level, President Biden's executive order on AI is probably the biggest step so far.
Right, I remember that. What's the focus?
It aims to promote ethical, safe, and trustworthy AI development and use. Really emphasizes American values, privacy, civil rights, civil liberties.
Okay, values-based. But what does it actually do?
Well, it gives guidelines for federal agencies on how they should buy and use AI responsibly. And it puts some transparency and accountability requirements on companies developing AI.
But it's an executive order, right? Not like the EU's law.
Exactly. It doesn't have the same legal weight. The enforcement mechanisms aren't nearly as clear-cut.
So more like a strong suggestion.
Kind of. And it actually calls on Congress to step up and pass real bipartisan legislation on AI and privacy to give these principles more teeth.
And is Congress doing that?
Well, we are seeing more specific, narrower bills being discussed. Things like requiring AI companies to disclose if they use copyrighted stuff to train their models. That's getting attention.
Okay. And what about the states? Often in the U.S., the states move faster than the federal government on tech stuff.
You're absolutely spot on there. We've seen some interesting action at the state level. Illinois, for instance, has the AI Video Interview Act.
Video interviews, what does that cover?
It makes employers tell job applicants if AI is analyzing their video interview, and it sets rules for handling that data. Then New York has an AI bias law.
For hiring, too.
Yeah, focused on hiring algorithms for bias and making those audit results public.
Transparency again.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you just have general state privacy laws. While not just about AI, they often have rules about automated decision-making and profiling.
Like?
Requiring companies to tell you when AI is making decisions about you, giving you opt-out rights, sometimes even explaining the logic or doing impact assessments. So yeah, lots bubbling up from the states while the feds figure out the bigger picture.
Didn't California try something more ambitious recently? SB 1047.
Yes, that generated a lot of buzz. It focused on safety standards for really powerful, high-cost AI models.
And what happened?
It aimed for pretty strict safety rules, but Governor Newsom actually vetoed it.
Vetoed? Why?
He cited concerns it could stifle innovation, said he preferred a more balanced, risk-based approach, which, sounds a bit like the EU's thinking in a way.
Interesting. Shows the internal debate in the U.S.
Definitely highlights that tension between regulation and progress.
Yeah.
We also have the AI Bill of Rights.
Ah, yes, the blueprint.
Right, but it's important to remember that's a set of voluntary commitments. Ethical principles like fairness, transparency, privacy, good goals, but not legally enforceable.
Got it. Voluntary. And what about AI and intellectual property? Copyright seems like a huge issue.
It really is. A big flashpoint in the U.S. right now.
What's the latest?
Well, the U.S. Copyright Office ruled that AI-generated artwork at least if there isn't significant human creative input, can't be copyright.
No copyright for purely AI art.
Not according to them, no.
Yeah.
And that's obviously sparked a lot of debate among lawyers, artists, tech companies.
I can imagine. And is anyone else policing AI in the U.S., like consumer protection agencies?
Yeah, the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, is definitely stepping up. They're scrutinizing AI much more closely for consumer protection issues, unfair practices.
Also,
They've launched investigations like into OpenAI. They've cracked down on companies making, baseless claims about their AI products. And they've issued guidance emphasizing transparency, explainability, fairness, data security, basically telling companies what they expect.
okay, so the FTC is active. But overall, this U.S. approach more cautious? Wait and see, what's the potential downside globally?
Well, a potential consequence is that maybe like with data privacy before GDPR, the U.S. might end up having less influence on the global rules. That Brussels effect could mean the EU standard becomes the default that U.S. companies have to follow anyway.
Interesting point. The risk of falling behind in setting the terms. Okay, let's pivot now. China, their strategy seems quite different again.
It really does. China's approach to AI regulation is, well, fascinating. It's a strong mix of pushing really hard for AI innovation while also maintaining significant state control over the technology.
And their goal is clear, right? Global leadership.
Very clear. They want to be the world leader in AI by 2030. And they definitely see the U.S. as the main competitor they need to overtake.
So how does their regulatory approach reflect that ambition and that focus on state control?
Well, China uses a whole toolbox of policies to boost its AI sector. This includes their broader tech laws, things covering data privacy, rules on sending data overseas. It all feeds into their AI goals.
It's interesting, though, weren't they quite quick on some AI rules, even while maybe following the EU more on data privacy initially?
That's a good point. While their early data privacy laws seemed somewhat inspired by the EU, especially on consumer rights, in AI itself, they've been forging a more distinct path and often moving very fast.
You mentioned their agile regulatory approach before. What does that actually look like? How do they do it?
It's a very quick iterative method. They tend to roll out policies targeting specific AI areas as they become prominent, often starting with draft rules, getting feedback from industry, academics, and then finalizing them quickly.
Can you give an example?
The best recent example is probably their rules on generative AI. A draft came out in April 2023, and the final version was already in place by August that same year.
Wow, April to August. That is incredibly fast.
It really is.
What are the pros and cons of moving that quickly?
Well, the big pro is adaptability. They can react really swiftly to new tech, like generative AI. We saw in Europe how ChatGPT's arrival meant they had to figure out how to fit it into the existing AI Act framework they were already building.
Right, takes time.
Yeah. But the downside of China's speed is that the rules might not feel fully stable yet. It can create gray areas, uncertainty for companies trying to comply, and sometimes the enforcement isn't entirely clear either.
Did the feedback process actually change anything? Did they soften rules to help adoption?
Interestingly, yes.
Yeah.
We saw some initial very strict requirements get eased a bit after feedback. Suggests they're trying to balance control with making sure AI adoption isn't totally stifled.
Like what?
For instance, a really strict rule about guaranteeing the accuracy of AI outputs was changed to more of a best effort standard. They also have specific regulations already on things like algorithmic recommendations and deep synthesis or deep fakes.
Okay. And what about that copyright issue we discussed? How does China see AI-generated content?
This is a really significant difference. Back in November 2023, a court in Beijing actually ruled that AI-generated content could be eligible for copyright protection.
Really? Opposite to the U.S. ruling, then?
Exactly. Stands in stark contrast to the U.S. position and could be quite different from where the EU ends up, too. It definitely signals a very supportive stance towards AI adoption in China.
But raises questions about human creativity, I suppose.
Big questions, yeah.
You keep mentioning state control as central. How exactly does that play out in their AI rules?
It's really the defining feature. Making sure AI development stays aligned with the correct political direction, as President Xi Jinping put it, that's absolutely paramount.
So even if they ease some rules for business, the political control remains.
It seems so, yes. Especially for AI systems that the public interacts with directly. This can lead to things like censorship or selective enforcement of the rules, which is quite different from the focus on individual rights or democratic checks you see emphasized in the EU and US discussions.
And it's not just laws, is it? State influence goes beyond that.
Definitely. There's also significant public investment being used strategically to steer AI companies towards national goals and objectives.
Can you give some specific examples of their regulations, like for recommendation algorithms or facial recognition?
Sure. For AI recommendation algorithms, think social media feeds, e-commerce, the rules, try to limit discrimination, reduce the spread of what the state considers harmful information.
Okay.
And interestingly, they even address things like exploitative working conditions for delivery drivers whose jobs are managed by these algorithms.
That's specific. What rights do users have?
Users have the right to turn off personalized recommendations, and they should get explanations if an algorithm significantly affects their interests.
And deepfakes or deep synthesis.
For deep synthesis tech, the rules say the generated content must meet information control standards. It has to be clearly labeled as AI generated.
Labeling, okay.
And the providers have to try and prevent misuse and register their algorithms. These rules include some pretty broad censorship requirements, too.
Right, and facial recognition. We hear a lot about its use in China.
Yes, its use by law enforcement is widespread. But for non-governmental use, the regulations say it needs a specific purpose, it should only be used if other methods aren't enough, and in public places, it's primarily justified for public safety reasons.
So it's this really unique blend then, pushing innovation, strong state control, and also addressing some societal issues, all within China's very specific context.
Exactly. It reflects their unique situation.
Now, there's another really important player we should talk about, India. They seem to be carving out their own path, too.
Absolutely. India's made a major statement with its India AI mission. It was approved just in March 2024, and with a pretty significant budget attached.
India AI mission. What's the core idea?
Their vision is summed up in the phrase, making AI in India and making AI work for India.
Kitschy. So building domestic capacity and using AI for India's specific needs.
Precisely. The main goal is building a whole ecosystem to really kickstart AI innovation, largely through public-private partnerships.
And how are they planning to do that? What are the components?
It's built on several key pillars. First, there's the India AI compute capacity.
Compute. So hardware, processing power.
Yeah, basically building up the high-end computing infrastructure needed for AI. They're aiming for 10,000 plus GPUs, again, through public-private partnership, and creating an AI marketplace. Think AI as a service, pre-trained models available for use.
Okay, tackling the infrastructure bottleneck. What else?
And there's the India AI Innovation Center. This is focused on developing and deploying India's own large multimodal models, LMMs, and also foundation models tailored for specific critical sectors in India.
So really building their own foundational AI tech, not just relying on imports.
Exactly, aiming for that tech sovereignty. Another pillar is the India AI Datasets platform.
Data is crucial for AI. What's this about?
It's about making it easier for Indian startups and researchers to get access to good quality, non-personal data sets. A unified platform to streamline that access.
Makes sense. What about actual applications?
That's the India AI Application Development Initiative. It promotes AI apps in key sectors based on real-world problems identified by government bodies, focusing on things that can have a big socioeconomic impact.
Using AI for development goals.
Right. And recognizing you need the people too, there's India AI Future Skills.
Training.
Yep. More AI courses in universities, setting up data and AI labs outside the major hubs in Tier 2 and 3 cities to spread the skills.
Good thinking. Funding is often an issue for startups, too.
They've thought of that. India AI Startup Financing, aiming to make it easier for deep tech AI startups to get funding.
Okay, that covers compute, models, data, apps, skills funding. Anything else?
One more key pillar, safe and trusted AI. This involves actually implementing responsible AI projects, developing India's own tools for things like bias checking, self-assessment checklists for developers, and creating governance frameworks.
So they're building the responsible AI piece right into the mission from the start.
It seems so, yes. It looks like a very well-thought-out, ambitious plan covering many bases needed for a strong AI ecosystem.
It certainly sounds comprehensive. What's the overall goal then?
Really, it seems geared towards speeding up innovation, building that domestic capability we talked about, creating skilled jobs, showing how AI can be used for social good, and ultimately making India more competitive globally in AI.
Okay, so we've looked at the EU's comprehensive approach. The U.S.'s more fragmented, innovation-first strategy, China's state-controlled acceleration, and India's mission-driven ecosystem building. Quite a diverse landscape.
It really is.
So where does this leave us? Can we draw any big conclusions yet? Is any one approach emerging as the clear global standard for regulating AI?
It really feels too early to say definitively. Unlike data privacy, where GDPR eventually became so influential, there isn't that single clear benchmark for AI regulation just yet.
And each region seems to have its own hurdles in becoming that benchmark, right?
Exactly. Each faces its own distinct challenges.
Let's recap those briefly. For the EU,
The big challenge is that regulatory agility we mentioned. Can their detailed framework keep up with the sheer speed of AI development?
okay. And for the US,
The lack of a single cohesive federal framework makes it harder to offer a clear model internationally. It's still quite piecemeal.
right. And China,
For China, while they move fast, that very speed and the potential for ongoing changes in their rules could create instability or uncertainty, which might hinder development and investment in the long run.
so looking ahead, say into 2025, what's the general vibe? Still very much in motion.
Absolutely. The global AI regulatory landscape is undoubtedly still fluid, still evolving. We're going to see continued action, debates, refinements in all these places as they keep grappling with AI's complexities.
So maybe a final thought to leave you, the listener, with. Considering these very different approaches, the EU's risk-based structure, the US focus on guidelines and sectors, China's blend of speed and control, India's mission, which approach, or maybe some combination, do you think might ultimately strike the best balance?
Yeah, the balance between fostering innovation, which we all want, and ensuring safety and responsible use, which we definitely need.
And how might these different philosophies reflect or even shape diverse societal values globally? What are the long-term consequences going to be for how AI develops and how it impacts all our lives?
It's definitely something to keep thinking about as this whole story continues to unfold.
Indeed. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into what is undeniably a complex and incredibly important topic, global AI regulation.
We really encourage you to consider these different strategies, their potential impacts. Keep exploring this evolving world of AI and keep thinking critically about that crucial balance between innovation and responsibility.